Alabama.
Thank you. I guess there's a question in there someplace for Mr. Geithner.
No, there wasn't.
Oh,
Yeah, the rules say, I'm sorry, this won't come out of the gentleman's time.
oh
The
sure.
rules say each member has 5 minutes.
Oh, you're right. You're
Sing
absolutely
a song if you want to.
Secretary Geithner, how can you say that the regulatory reform bill in the Senate is comprehensive when it doesn't include the GSEs reform? And as Chairman Franks just said, we all realize now that that's a critical part of financial reform.
Well, I said the House bill is comprehensive too, and I agree with it. Reform of the housing finance system is going to be a critical part of overall financial reform. But for reasons I think you understand, we decided to do this in 2 stages, and we're now at the beginning of the next stage, and this is going to be a very complicated, consequential process. And we're going to have to take a careful look across, again, the full range of institutions that operate in these markets. There are parts of the system that worked very well over a very long period of time, but there's parts of the system.
Of course, you know, Fannie and Freddie was not a part of the system that worked very well.
No, I think that I agree with you about that. I think that you can't, if you look over the past decade, a lot of things went wrong. The system did work relatively well for a long period of time, but things started to change at the beginning of this decade. And at that point, you saw Fannie and Freddie start to build up these very large retained portfolios, huge amount of risk in those portfolios. They also started to provide guarantees that ultimately resulted in them taking on more credit risk than they were charging for. Both those mistakes were central to the problem.
All right, Mr. Secretary, you know, I would have to disagree with you. You know, in 1997, they started making loans without down payments and to people with questionable credit. So I think that it was a disaster waiting to happen. And I will say that several of us did speak on the House floor at that time and resisted the Clinton administration's efforts to relax those standards.
Well, there was you know, I was not a combatant in these debates in that period of time, but there was a long period of advocacy by people up here in the Congress on both sides of the aisle and in the administration starting in the late 90s designed to try to bring stronger oversight, greater constraints in them. But of course, ultimately, as many of you have said, those efforts were not successful, and that was a very consequential failure of policy.
Right. You know, I think the time is now, not, you know, not some second stage. But let me ask you this. Several alternatives have been suggested to reform them. One is to simply to nationalize them and make the government guarantees explicit and permanent and allow them to continue to have a line of credit with the Treasury and borrow from the Fed and be exempted from state and local taxes. Another is to create more GSEs to compete against each other, and this is the government competing against itself. But still, with the government subsidy and guarantees and privileges. Isn't it a better alternative to do what we Republicans are saying, at least, you know, long term, and that's phase out the government's subsidy and guarantee of the duopoly over time, transition housing finance to a competitive market-based environment, and implement withdrawal of all federal government support?
I agree with you, Congressman, that I do not think either of the 2 options you began with look particularly appealing at this stage.
What now?
I think the 2 options you laid out at the beginning, full nationalization or creating a whole new class of GSEs to compete with each other with the same basic model, those do not look like appealing options to me. I have not had a chance to look in detail at your proposed alternative, but I will, and happy to spend time working closely with you on that. I think you ended by saying transition to a world in which you phase out all government support in any form. Is that what you said?
Well, particularly the GSE that has a line of credit with the Treasury or ability to borrow from the Fed or exempt from state and local taxes.
I personally think, as I said in my testimony, I think we need to end a system in which you have this awkward combination of private shareholders with a broad sense of explicit implicit support. I think that system was a terrible mistake. Those mistakes were very consequential. And when, as we work together to create a new system to replace our current one, we can at least agree we should not recreate that fatal mix of public and private shareholders in the same institution.
But you know, I think as long as you have a government entity competing with the private market, you subsidize them in any way, it's unfair competition, and I think it crowds out the private market. And I think we've seen the result of that.
Well, I think, again, this is at the heart of this debate will be to think about what is the appropriate role for the government in providing some form of guarantees to assure a more stable flow of housing finance, and what role should the private markets face? That's the fundamental question we face, and we should take a fresh, cold look at that, and that's going to be critical to reach consensus on before we figure out what the transition period should be to that transition path should be to that new regime.
And I think
Gentleman from